Marcus stood in the dim light of his home office, the hum of his laptop the only sound in the room. On the screen, the damning evidence glared back at him. A stream of messages, photos, and videos exchanged between Ashley and Ethan. Words he never imagined she'd say to someone else. Images that made his stomach churn. And confessions of feelings that ripped at the edges of his composure. Ashley had left her phone on the kitchen counter earlier that evening, a rare lapse in her otherwise meticulous nature. It wasn't curiosity that drove him to glance at it when it buzzed. It was instinct, honed by months of her unexplained absences and distant behavior. His hand trembled as he tapped the screen. There it was, the proof of her betrayal. He thought back to when they first met. Ashley's laugh had been what drew him in, a sound so full of life that it seemed to brighten every room. She'd been his partner in everything, his career, his dreams, his life. They had built this together, a life of stability and promise. And yet, here she was, tearing it apart for a man who clearly didn't respect the sanctity of anyone else's home, let alone theirs. Ashley came home that night, her usual grace marred by an edge of nervous energy. She kissed him on the cheek, her lips cold and distant. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice casual. Too casual. Marcus studied her, his mind running through the ways he could confront her. He could yell, he could beg for answers, but none of those options felt right. Instead, he simply nodded. That night he lay in bed beside her, wide awake as she slept soundly. Did she feel guilt? Did she even care? As her breathing deepened, Marcus resolved to take back control. He wouldn't rage, he wouldn't wallow, he would act. The next morning, Marcus excused himself from breakfast early, retreating to his office. He spent hours compiling everything, screenshots of texts, copies of emails, and images she thought she had deleted. Every piece of evidence went into a file marked simply, truth. He knew Ashley valued appearances above all. She had spent years cultivating an image of the perfect wife, the doting partner who balanced elegance and charm effortlessly. It wasn't enough for Marcus to confront her in private. He wanted her duplicity to face the light of day. If she wanted to live a double life, he would ensure the world knew exactly what that entailed. The opportunity came a week later. Ashley had planned a dinner party for their closest friends, a carefully curated group who admired her for her grace and poise. Marcus helped set the table, his movements deliberate, his expression unreadable. As the evening unfolded, Marcus played the role of the doting husband, laughing at the right moments, refilling wine glasses, and offering compliments that felt hollow in his mouth. Ashley sparkled as she always did, her laugh ringing out as she entertained their guests. But Marcus noticed the way her eyes flicked to her phone when it buzzed, the subtle way her smile faltered when she saw the screen. Toward the end of the evening, Marcus cleared his throat. "I have something to share," he began, his voice steady. All eyes turned to him, Ashley included, her expression curious but wary. "Recently," he continued, "I've discovered some things about my wife, things I think it's important for everyone here to know." Ashley's face drained of color. "Marcus," she said, her voice low, "what are you doing?" He ignored her, reaching for the tablet he'd placed discreetly on the sideboard. With a swipe, he projected a series of images onto the television screen behind him. Gasps filled the room as Ashley's messages to Ethan appeared, one after another, alongside timestamps and images. "This is who she's been when you weren't looking," Marcus said calmly, his eyes never leaving hers. "This is the truth behind the facade." Ashley rose to her feet, her hands trembling. "Stop this, Marcus, please." But he didn't stop. The friends who had once admired her sat in stunned silence, their faces a mix of pity and disgust. Ethan's name was whispered among them, recognition dawning on some as they pieced together the story. When it was over, Ashley fled the room, tears streaming down her face. Marcus remained behind, a man exhausted but resolute. The humiliation she had begged him to spare her from had come to pass, and there was no undoing it now. As the last of their guests left, Marcus sat alone in the now silent house. The ache in his chest was heavy, but so was the relief. He had taken a stand, reclaimed his dignity, and exposed the lies that had threatened to consume him. The road ahead would be long, and the fallout from his actions would undoubtedly be messy. But as the clock struck midnight, Marcus allowed himself one small comfort. He was no longer shackled by secrets. He had set himself free. The echoes of the dinner party reverberated long after the guests had left. Marcus sat alone at the kitchen table, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at the wreckage of his once perfect life. Upstairs he could hear the muffled sounds of Ashley's sobs, her cries subdued by the walls that now felt like a fortress of betrayal. His decision to expose her had been deliberate, but the emotional toll weighed on him nonetheless. Their entire relationship had been deliberate, but the emotional toll weighed on him nonetheless. Marcus wasn't a cruel man by nature, but betrayal had a way of sharpening edges that were once soft. He thought about how Ashley had begged him not to reveal her secret, the tears in her eyes that might have once moved him to forgiveness. Now they felt like another manipulation, a desperate attempt to salvage the image she cared about more than their marriage. The next morning, the consequences of the previous night began to unfold. Ashley stayed in the bedroom, her absence from the kitchen as Marcus prepared his coffee both noticeable and oddly relieving. When she finally emerged, her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus set his mug down and gestured to the chair opposite him. He remained silent, his expression stoic as she took her seat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ashley fidgeted, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the edge of the table. "I never wanted it to get this far," she began, her voice trembling. "Ethan, he was a mistake." "A mistake," Marcus repeated, his voice cold. "Is that what you call it when you plan weekends with someone else? When you lie to my face for months?" Ashley winced but pressed on. "It wasn't about you. It was never about you. She faltered, searching for words that wouldn't come. "It was about you," Marcus interjected, his tone sharp. "Your selfishness, your vanity. You thought you could have it all and that I'd never see through it." Her eyes filled with tears again, but Marcus didn't flinch. The tears that had once softened him now felt like weapons she wielded when cornered. In the days that followed, the fallout rippled beyond their home. The group chat that had once been filled with jokes and dinner plans became a battleground of whispers. Ashley's betrayal had been a private sin, but Marcus's public exposure of it turned it into a spectacle. Friends who had admired her charm now kept their distance, their loyalty quietly shifting to Marcus. Ethan, too, felt the heat. The whispers reached his workplace, his colleagues piecing together the puzzle. Ashley had underestimated the cost of her deception, believing her affair would stay hidden, confined to secret texts and stolen moments. Instead, it had become a story people discussed in hushed tones over coffee, her reputation unraveling thread by thread. Marcus spent his days in quiet reflection, piecing together the remnants of his life. He immersed himself in his work, finding solace in the precision and logic of his projects. In the evenings, he would walk alone in the park, allowing the crisp air to clear his mind. Each step was a reminder that he was moving forward, away from the lies and toward something new, even if he didn't yet know what that was. One afternoon, as he scrolled through his phone, he noticed a message from an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. "Saw what happened. If you ever want to grab a drink, I'm here." It was a small gesture, but it reminded Marcus that he wasn't entirely alone. Meanwhile, Ashley tried to rebuild. She made half-hearted attempts to reach out to friends, only to be met with polite indifference. Even her family, who had always supported her, seemed distant. The betrayal had tainted her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Ethan, once her confidant and partner in rebellion, stopped returning her calls. The backlash had proven too much for him to bear, and he retreated into his own life, leaving Ashley to face the consequences alone. Marcus didn't celebrate her downfall. He found no joy in watching her struggle, though he couldn't ignore the faint satisfaction of knowing she was finally experiencing the weight of her actions. For too long, she had lived in a world where her charm had shielded her from accountability. Now she had no such protection. As the days turned to weeks, Marcus began to see a path forward. The anger and pain still lingered, but they no longer consumed him. He started to envision a future without Ashley, one where he could rediscover himself in the life he had once dreamed of. For the first time in months, Marcus felt the faint stirrings of hope. He had faced the worst of it and come out on the other side. Now it was time to rebuild, not for her, not for anyone else, but for himself. The whispers had grown louder. Everywhere Ashley went, the weight of her actions followed her like a shadow. Marcus's decision to expose her wasn't just a personal reckoning. It was a public unmasking. What once had been her carefully cultivated image of sophistication and grace now felt like an empty shell. People she thought were friends now avoided her, their polite smiles hiding judgment. Even casual acquaintances seemed to look at her differently, their eyes holding a mix of pity and disdain. At first, Ashley tried to salvage what she could. She attempted to explain herself to close friends, spinning her actions as a mistake brought on by loneliness and neglect. But the evidence Marcus had shared was irrefutable, and her excuses only made her look desperate. Some friends offered half-hearted reassurances, but the underlying discomfort was undeniable. Others outright severed ties, unwilling to be associated with someone whose betrayal had become the talk of their social circles. Ethan, her partner in betrayal, had vanished entirely. The moment the backlash began, he had distanced himself, leaving Ashley to face the fallout alone. She had called him repeatedly, leaving messages she knew he would never answer. His silence was a brutal reminder that their relationship, such as it was, had been built on lies and convenience rather than anything lasting. Marcus, meanwhile, was finding his footing. The initial sting of betrayal had dulled into a quiet determination. He channeled his energy into his work, tackling projects with a renewed focus that impressed his colleagues. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of clarity. The burden of Ashley's lies was gone, replaced by the steady rhythm of a life he was beginning to rebuild. He started reconnecting with old friends, people he had unintentionally drifted away from during his marriage. One evening, over a beer with his college roommate Sam, Marcus found himself laughing for the first time in weeks. The sound surprised him, a reminder that joy was still possible, even in the aftermath of heartbreak. "You're doing the right thing," Sam said, clinking his bottle against Marcus's. "She underestimated you, but you've shown her you're not someone to mess with." It wasn't about revenge anymore, Marcus realized. It was about reclaiming his dignity and setting boundaries for what he would and wouldn't accept in his life. The aftermath of Marcus's actions didn't just affect Ashley, it rippled into their shared social circles and professional lives. Marcus began to receive quiet nods of respect from colleagues and acquaintances who had heard about the ordeal. "Tough break," one coworker had said in passing, "but you handled it like a pro." It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind Marcus that his choices had value beyond the immediate pain they caused. Ashley, on the other hand, struggled to find stability. Her workplace became a minefield of awkward interactions, whispers in hallways, and stares she couldn't ignore. The polished confidence she once carried had given way to a brittle fragility. The more she tried to hold on to her old life, the more it seemed to slip away. One evening, as Marcus walked through the park, he noticed a family laughing together on a picnic blanket. The sight triggered a pang of regret for the life he had envisioned with Ashley, the future they had promised each other but could never have. But rather than wallowing in the loss, Marcus took a deep breath and let the feeling pass. He was starting to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting the pain, but learning to live alongside it and, eventually, beyond it. Marcus returned home that night to an email notification from his lawyer. The divorce papers were ready. As he read through the document, a quiet resolve settled over him. This wasn't the end he had envisioned for his marriage, but it was the beginning of something new, a future he could build on his own terms, free from lies and betrayal. The days turned into weeks, and the dust of Marcus's tumultuous revelations began to settle. Life had not returned to normal, but it was inching toward a new kind of balance, one that Marcus could control. The divorce proceedings were underway, a process that was both cathartic and exhausting. Ashley's attempts to negotiate were met with a firm but unyielding stance from Marcus. He had been lenient for too long, and now it was time to prioritize his well-being. One morning, as Marcus reviewed the divorce documents at his kitchen table, he paused to sip his coffee. The silence of the house was no longer oppressive, but liberating. It was the space where he could think, plan, and dream without the shadow of betrayal looming over him. He'd recently started journaling, a practice he'd never considered before, to sort through his emotions and reflect on what he wanted for the future. Writing had become a surprising outlet for him. On one page, he poured out his frustrations about the marriage. On another, he listed goals he had long neglected. Taking a road trip across the country, reconnecting with family, and even learning to play the piano, an old dream from his youth. It wasn't just about moving on, it was about rediscovering who he was before the marriage consumed so much of his identity. Ashley, meanwhile, found herself on unstable ground. With Ethan gone and her social connections fractured, she was navigating a world that felt increasingly isolating. She had never anticipated the full fallout of her actions, nor how much Marcus's quiet but decisive retaliation would upend her life. Her attempts to rebuild her reputation were met with lukewarm responses. People were polite but distant. unwilling to fully trust someone who had shown such calculated deception. At work, her once admired charisma now felt hollow to those around her. A rumor spread that she was applying for positions elsewhere, a quiet admission of her struggle to maintain her footing in familiar spaces. For the first time in years, Ashley was forced to confront herself, without the validation of others, to shield her from the consequences of her choices. For Marcus, the community's quiet acknowledgement of his strength provided unexpected solace. Neighbors who had once been casual acquaintances now greeted him with warmth and understanding. One day, while jogging through the park, an older man who often waved in passing stopped him. "I heard about what you went through," the man said, extending a hand. "Takes a strong purse to handle it the way you did." Marcus shook his hand, the words settling over him like a balm. He didn't need public vindication, but the recognition reminded him that his actions mattered, not just to himself, but to others who might one day face similar trials. In small but meaningful steps, Marcus began to explore new possibilities. He attended a local art exhibit, where he struck up a conversation with a woman who shared his interest in photography. He signed up for a cooking class, embracing the idea of stepping outside his comfort zone. Each new experience felt like a brick in the foundation of a new life, one that he was building deliberately and thoughtfully. One evening, as Marcus sorted through old photo albums, he stumbled across pictures from the early days of his marriage. There were smiles, laughter, and moments that felt almost alien now. He didn't tear the photos apart or bury them in a box. Instead, he acknowledged them for what they were, a part of his story, but not the whole. "Every bridge needs a solid foundation," he murmured to himself. "Even the ones we have to rebuild." As the night deepened, Marcus stood at his window, looking out at the city lights. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like his own. The past was a weight he could finally begin to set down, and the future was his to shape. Months had passed since Marcus had dropped the bombshell that shattered his marriage, and life had begun to take on a different rhythm. The quiet of his home, once a painful reminder of Ashley's absence, now felt like a canvas for new possibilities. The scars of betrayal hadn't fully healed. Marcus knew they might never completely fade, but they no longer dictated his every thought. He had turned a corner, and for the first time, the path ahead felt open. The divorce finalized without much fanfare. Marcus had stood firm during negotiations, refusing to let Ashley manipulate him as she once might have. She attempted to appeal to his better nature, reminding him of their good years, but her words rang hollow against the backdrop of her actions. The final settlement left Marcus with the house and a sense of closure he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't. Ashley's departure from their shared home had been unceremonious. Marcus watched from the living room as she carried her belongings to the waiting car. There had been no shouting, no dramatic farewells, just a heavy silence broken only by the occasional scrape of moving boxes. As she closed the trunk, she turned to him one last time. "I hope you find happiness, Marcus," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "I will," he replied, his tone steady. "I hope you do too, Asher." And with that, she drove away, leaving Marcus to face a future that was entirely his own. The first weeks of true solitude were difficult but necessary. Marcus found himself reflecting on the ways he had lost pieces of himself during his marriage. He had always been analytical, pragmatic, and driven, but somewhere along the way, those traits had been turned inward, used to rationalize his wife's behavior instead of standing up for himself. Now, he resolved to reclaim those qualities and use them to rebuild his life. He began with small acts of self-care, organizing his home, cooking meals that he enjoyed, and dedicating time to hobbies he had once loved but neglected. His love for photography resurfaced, and he spent weekends exploring the city with his camera. Marcus found beauty in the ordinary. A child chasing bubbles in the park, sunlight breaking through autumn leaves, the serene expression of an elderly woman feeding pigeons. Each image felt like a reminder that life continued, vibrant and full of unexpected grace. Work became a sanctuary of sorts. Marcus threw himself into projects with renewed vigor, earning the admiration of his colleagues. His boss approached him one day after a meeting. "You've been on fire lately, Marcus," she said. "Have you ever thought about taking on a leadership role?" The idea surprised him, but he realized it excited him too. For years he had avoided the spotlight, content to let others take the lead. Now he saw it as an opportunity to challenge himself, to step into a version of himself that was stronger and more confident. Socially, Marcus began to re-engage with the world. Old friendships that had grown distant during his marriage were rekindled, and new connections began to form. One evening, At a gallery opening, he struck up a conversation with a woman named Claire, an artist whose abstract paintings intrigued him. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, weaving between art, philosophy, and the nuances of life's struggles. Marcus wasn't ready to date, not yet, but the exchange reminded him that connections could still be meaningful and fulfilling. Claire invited him to a creative workshop she was hosting, and though he hesitated at first, Marcus decided to attend. The workshop was an eclectic mix of people sketching, painting, and sculpting, each absorbed in their own world. Marcus, with his camera, felt out of place at first, but as he captured candid moments, laughter shared between strangers, the intensity of concentration on an artist's face, he realized he was creating something that mattered. In his quiet moments, Marcus reflected on what he had learned. Betrayal had been a devastating blow, but it had also been a catalyst for growth. He no longer saw himself as a victim, but as someone who had endured and emerged stronger. Forgiveness, he discovered, wasn't about excusing Ashley's actions. It was about releasing the hold her betrayal had on him. One evening, as he reviewed his photographs, Marcus came across an image he'd taken of a bridge. It wasn't a remarkable structure, just a simple footbridge over a small creek, but the way the light filtered through the trees gave it a golden glow. It struck him as a perfect metaphor for his journey, a symbol of transition, of crossing from one place to another. He printed the photo and hung it in his living room, a quiet reminder of how far he had come. Life didn't return to the way it had been before Ashley's betrayal. Instead, it transformed into something entirely new. Marcus learned to embrace the uncertainty of the future, trusting himself to navigate whatever lay ahead. The pain of the past would always be a part of his story, but it no longer defined him. Episodes ended, a hyper-exciting overlay of his life after Ashley's murder and the collapse of the wall that had appeared until the hope next door seemed distant. As he stood at his window one evening, looking out at the city lights, Marcus felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The road to renewal hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. He was finally free to live, to grow, and to love again, on his own terms.